Thank you, Paolo, and good to hear just now from Sigmar. I endorse his remarks in terms of the future of a G20 Secretariat to give it long-term focus. Good to be here also with Carl, one of Europe's most intellectually acute contributors to the public policy debate across the world. And thank you to our friends in Italy and to Jim McGann and the University of Pennsylvania and the work they do to support the operations of think tanks around the world. Now, Paolo, you mentioned that you're in Milano. I've been to Milano a few times, not a bad town. In fact, quite a good town. Lots going on in Milano in a normal season. You mentioned the palazzo that you're in and the Mappa Mundi that you have there. And the Mappa Mundi actually lacks certain parts of the world. Well, that's what we call the Eurocentric worldview. And that is a lot of parts of the world actually disappear off the edge. It reminds me of when I went as Prime Minister to see the Pope. And if you go to the Vatican apartments and you see the marvelous Mappa Mundi from the 16th century arranged around the walls of the papal apartments, no Australia, not much of Southeast Asia, and frankly, India is a cartographical error, and as for China, well, not much better. But it's an interesting insight into the changing structure of the world. The term Asia, for example, meaning the East, is a construction of Western psychology. That is, it is to the east of the West. And because you are in the West, you get to name the compass points in relation to yourself. Well, that's about to change and is changing. I don't say that as a matter of East Asian celebration, just as a matter of pragmatic reality. By the time this decade is finished, 50% of global GDP will come from this hemisphere, the Asian hemisphere. And as a consequence, therefore, the world continues to change. That's an underpinning economic reality. So based on those observations, let me make 4 or 5 very quick remarks. One, what matters in determining global decision-making. 2, the G20, G7 architectural split. 3, US-China within the G20. And then 4, pandemics, and 5, migration. On the first, what matters at, let's call it large global gatherings? You're about to host the G20, for example, in Italy. I remember attending a major economies meeting in Italy in L'Aquila, just after it had been destroyed by an earthquake, with the unforgettable Silvio Berlusconi. The bottom line is, in my experience, and perhaps Carl will have reflections on this as well, is that in making decisions, 3 things matter. Ideas matter. They really do matter. The most underrated element of the trilogy, or of the Trinity. The second is institutions themselves, in, as it were, preparing the machinery for decision-making and the execution decision-making. And 3, the alchemy of leadership. If you miss one of those 3, as we'd say in Australia, you're buggered. It doesn't work. Ideas, institution, plus leadership. It doesn't matter, it doesn't mean that, for example, in a gathering of the G20, you're going to have 20 leaders. 2 or 3 are very helpful. Even 1 will do. If you don't have any, then again, you're in difficulty. The second point was about the G20, G7 split. The G7, as you know, essentially is the West plus 1, Japan. China's critique of the G7 is that it's Japan pretending to be in the West. And so it really is the West. The G20, and remember it was a Republican president's innovation, George W. Bush, actually extended the membership so that now 8 of the 20 actually come from Asia, if we include West Asia as well. Sigmar is right. When you looked at the critical and rapid decision-making in response to the global financial crisis, as a participant in those meetings and as a co-founder of the G20, it worked well. But it worked well because of ideas, the institution, the inherent legitimacy of bringing people from all continents, plus leadership. 4 or 5 people actually made it happen. And when we look to the future in terms of the unfolding dichotomy between the United States and China, the reason the G7 doesn't work anymore for global decision-making, it works for decision-making within the collective West, is that the G7 does not have China at the table, nor does it have Russia at the table. Both of those are at the G20 table. And it therefore becomes the critical institution to find and navigate a way through for the future. That is important. Third point I was going to make is, so what about the US and China, and can it work? A lot of our think tank work in New York and the Asia Society Policy Institute, which I have led for the last 5 years, is around this idea of managed strategic competition. It borrows some principles from the earlier period of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States immediately following the Cuban Missile Crisis. How could you manage this deep strategic competition between Moscow and Washington without permanently being in danger of sliding off the edge into crisis, conflict, and war? So when I've argued, for example, and stuff I've written in Foreign Affairs magazine and elsewhere for managed strategic competition, it is not a utopian vision. It is a very pragmatic, realist vision of how do you identify strategic red lines and manage them? How do you therefore provide space and scope for full-blooded competition across the rest of the foreign policy and economic policy and, frankly, ideological space? But thirdly, simultaneously within the same framework of managed strategic competition, or MSC as I call it, creating space for continued bilateral and multilateral collaboration on the things that matter. Which brings me rapidly to my two last points on pandemics and migration. The G20, the UN, the WTO, everybody failed on the pandemic. That's the truth of it. It's an uncomfortable truth, but I think Helen Clark and President Sirleaf Johnson's recent report underlines that fact in stark, non-polemical terms. The key question for the future is, will we marshal the global political leadership through the G20, because it brings both, as it were, wings of the international community together, plus the non-aligneds, can we, for example, create an emergency crisis notification system within the G20 and therefore execute it through the WHO, which does not yield to any level of political interference anywhere. So that if there is medical advice from Wuhan, from Washington, or from Westphalia, which points to an emerging pandemic problem, the scientists take control, the information flow begins immediately, and the scientific-based responses flow. That takes power out of the hands of governments at a political level, but it does put power in the hands of the scientific community to deliver us the best responses and advice on what's happening and what to do about it. And my very final point is migration. Migration, of course, has dropped right off the international policy agenda because of the pandemic. Guess what? It's going to come back. In the case of the United States and Mexico and the border, it's already back, but it will come back for the rest of us as well. The sooner the G20 does the very hard institutional redesign for the International Refugees Convention to establish a balanced set of responsibilities between source countries, neighbouring countries, transit countries, and destination countries in the hands of an effectively functioning global institutional arrangement, then we are going to continue to have all the destabilizations and inhumanity that we've seen in decades past. So there are 5 quick reflections, Jim and Paolo, on the points you've asked me to address. Thank you for your time.